Well, I've ordered some new parts for the bike. I've ordered new rims, Borani rims for the wheels and new spokes, and some more bits and bobs. So until they arrive, I've got to turn my attention to the dreaded electrics, as I can't put it off anymore. As you see here, I've got a stainless steel tray where the electrics can live beneath the seat, and I've already bolted on the rectifier here, and I've got to find some room for some fuses too. But before we can make some progress with the wiring of the bike, I need to sit down and draw up a new wiring diagram for the whole bike, because I've got so many different parts that aren't standard on this bike, such as the speedo, the hand controls and so on, that I need to start again and come up with a brand new wiring diagram. And the other reason why I want to build a new wiring harness is because this is the original one. The bike didn't work when I got it, and this is how the wiring arrived in a bucket. I may be able to salvage a few bits and bobs from it, but essentially it's too far gone to worry about trying to use it on the bike, so I'm just going to start again. When it comes to designing a new wiring diagram, the starting point is obviously the original diagram. So here we have a couple of manuals with the wiring diagrams in the back. Now these are not very easy to follow. First of all, they're in black and white, which doesn't help, and this one is actually in Italian with Italian abbreviations, which again isn't very helpful. But fortunately I did find a decent wiring diagram in colour on the internet, which has been a bit of a lifesaver. So with that I could work out what was going on. Now when you first look at something like this, it's so complicated. It's like, how the hell do we work out what's going on here? And it is complicated. There's a lot of information condensed into a very small amount of space. It's very difficult to follow. So what I do is I break it all down into subsets. So I look at just the wiring for, say, the alternator, the rectifier to the battery, and then I look at the wiring for the starter motor and so on. So it breaks it down into much simpler steps. Also on my bike I'm going to lose a lot of this complexity, because I'm not going to have a lot of the things which are on here. For example, there's a side stand cutout. I'm not having that. I may have the lights on all the time, so that makes the switching a bit easier and so on. I also have a digital speedo, for example, so that's a lot simpler to wire up than the originals, which had a separate tacho speedo with light bulbs and God knows what else. Well, my aim is to get it as simple as possible and as neat as possible. Now for many years I steered well clear of electric, but one day I just thought it can't be that difficult. I programmed up mainframe computers back in the day, so I'm sure I can manage to work out where a few wires go. So my starting point is a little bit of reading, and I would recommend this book here, which I found very helpful. And with this and looking at the internet, Google, YouTube, pretty much everything you need to know is out there. So my first attempt at a wiring diagram looked something like this. Let's get rid of that. And this is my first attempt. It's not very good, but it's just a starter for 10. It's not very clear, it's not very complete, but it's just something to get me moving. I've got the headlamp there, the fuse box, alternator rectifier, coils. I've also included the new wiring for the speedo, the new idiot lights and so on, just to give me a sort of start. That was my Mark 1 version, which wasn't very good, so I then moved on for a Mark 2 version, which is looking a little bit more complete. I've started to do the colours as well. That's not essential, but it just helps to see where the power's coming from and so on. This isn't the final version either. I may do a Mark 3, a Mark 4, a Mark 5 until I'm happy with it, and I can then go forward and convert this into an actual wiring harness on the bike. So when it comes to building a new wiring harness for the bike, it's really in two parts. There's the theory, the logic of making sure all the wiring is correct, the power goes where it should, the switching is correct and so on. But then there's a second part, which is the actual making of the wiring harness to go on the bike and fitting it to the bike as neatly as possible. Now there's too much to go through in one short video when it comes to wiring a bike up, so I'll split this up into two parts. There'll be the logic and then there'll be the practical aspects of wiring up the bike. But what I can do now is give you a very simple example of how we can go from the theory to the practice. Now this is a circuit for the neutral light on the bike. So we'll start off with the battery with a positive and negative earth. The power from the battery will go through the ignition key, so nothing will happen until the ignition is turned on. The power will then go down to the neutral light itself, so that will glow green, and that is controlled by another switch linked to the gearbox, such that when it's in neutral, this switch is closed so that power can run all the way down to earth. And when it's not in neutral, that switch is open so nothing can happen and the light goes off. So now let's transfer this logical diagram into the real world. And here we have the green light, which must be powered by one of these wires here. Unfortunately, all 5 LED lights have the same colour, which doesn't help, but we'll work that out later on. Each one has 2 wires, a black and a red. The red will be the power, which on my diagram here will be coming from the ignition key at some point. And the other one is black, which will go from the light down to the switch to be earthed. So now we need to find where that neutral switch is. So let's go and find it. And there it is down there. It's a little switch attached to the side of the gearbox. Now all I've got to do now is take that black wire from the LED light all the way down through the bike down to here, and that completes the circuit. When the gearbox is in neutral, that switch is earthed, so the light will come on, and when it's not in neutral, the switch is not earthed anymore. That cuts out the circuit and the light goes out. Now another question is, what kind of wiring do you want to use? How thick should it be? What gauge should it be? Now wiring is assessed by how much amperage it can carry, and also by the cross-sectional area of the core. Now I tend to use this stuff, which I think is 2mm squared cross-sectional area, and it takes about 16 amps. That said, there are a few exceptions, and those are usually the main wire that takes power from the battery to the starter motor, because that's the biggest draw you'll find on a motorbike, and also the earth lead from the battery to the frame. Both of those need to be really thick to give the least resistance as possible. So here's an example I've made before. That's the kind of wire, that's the kind of thickness you'll want to go from the battery to the starter motor, and even bigger. This is the kind of lead you want to go from the battery earth back to the frame to earth the whole system. But those are the exceptions to the rule. Most of the wiring on a bike you can do with 16 amp wiring. So if we consider the physics of why this kind of wire might be okay, let's just do a simple calculation. The voltage of the bike is 12 volts. I've got a 16 amp wire. Now if we times them together, that gives us the wattage. So if we multiply the voltage by the ampage, that gives the wattage, which is about 180, something like that. And if you consider that a bright headlamp on main beams about 55 or 60 watts, there won't be very many applications on a bike which requires more than that level. The exceptions being, of course, the starter motor, which needs a hell of a lot of power, and the wires carrying the power from the alternator through the rectifier and onto the battery. They may need a little bit more. So that brings me to the end of the theory part of this 2-part video, and in the next video I will talk about the practicalities of wiring up the bike. So until then, thanks for watching and cheers.